Hey, so I went through the discussion boards, and I think everybody had a good grasp on what we were talking about this week, honestly, by and large. The things I saw about questions sort of had to do with nitty gritty stuff. About, like, oh, does this point really count as a happy ending? Does this point really count as right, etc.? But I feel like overall people understood really well what was going on, and in part that has to do with the nature of socialist realism, right? It has to be proletarian. It has to be easily understandable. So I thought what I'd do here is just real quick run through all three assignments for this week, thinking about them in terms of whether or not they conform to socialist realist requirements and how well they fit into the Caterina Clark model. And we'll just kind of review those things. And you can sort of check your analysis against what I present here. But I said it really seemed like people, even if every little point wasn't necessarily there, the people were really understanding in general what was going on. So we know that the requirements of Soviet socialist realism are that any work be realistic, and that has to do with style, right? The idea, so in visual art, that would mean that the painting looks like what it's meant to look like. In literature, the idea that there's no weird stylistic trickery or something like that. Maybe some of the things that we would associate with classic modernism or postmodernism or something, right? That's just very straightforward. If we're in a field, we're in a field, and that's that, right? So that's really an aesthetic and a stylistic thing. It has to be realistic. And if we think about all three of our stories this week, if we think about The Flower of Seven Colors, if we think about the old genie Khatabich, if we think about The Tale of the Military Secret, in the stylistic sense, they're all extremely realistic, right? There's no weird style trickery or anything. It's very straightforward aesthetically. So, we're fine there. It has to be realistic. It has to be typical. And here, of course, any fairy tale goes off the rails. So if we think about, Flower of Seven Colors, if we think about the old genie Khatabich, everything about the day-to-day existence of those characters is presented as really typical, right? Like Zhenya's going out for bagels, and then she wants to play with the little boys, in the yard of her building, and old genie Khatabich, oh, they're moving, he's starting at a new school, they're gonna go to the library, they're gonna see a, soccer game, whatever. Like, really typical stuff, right up until there's a magic flower, right up until there's a magic genie. Right? And there's just no getting around it. So this, in the sense, any fairy tale, almost any fairy tale, is going to deviate from the concept of typical at that point. But you'll notice that all of them, even The Tale of the Military Secret, which yes is set in military times, but for the Civil War era, the idea that everybody's going off to war and everybody's fighting the whites, I mean, that was typical, right? I mean, the country was at war. So everything is typical right up until the moment that the fairy tale element enters in, right? So it has to be proletarian. And remember, when we say proletarian, what we actually mean is extremely understandable. And the dumbest guy in the room has to be able to understand it, which tells you exactly how Stalin felt about the proletariat. But, this, of course, leads to this extremely didactic form of writing. Everything's easy to understand, right? We know that Zhenya is bad when she's making selfish wishes and good when she's making wishes for her comrade's sake, and etc., right? There's nothing about the message that is lost. There's nothing about the moral of the story, so to speak, that is difficult to decipher. It's you're a hero if you fight for the Red Army, right? If you help to defeat the White Army, you're a bad person if you fight for the White Army, right? I mean, all of this is just extremely straightforward. It's extremely easy to understand in terms of moral, in terms of theme, in terms of what we're supposed to take out of the stories, right? And then it has to be partisan. And by partisan, ideally, it was usually meant like straight up supporting the party, supporting Stalin. But if nothing else, it has to show partisan support for socialist values. And again, these do. I mean, so in The Tale of the Military Secret, we have, straight up, we are fighting for the Red Army, right? It's literally partisan in that sense. The old genie Khatabich, and the Flower of Seven Colors, those stick more to the values of socialism. But again, we see over and over again in those stories these lessons about you don't want to be selfish. Instead, you want to make, you care about your fellow man. You're worried about the community. You're thinking in communal terms rather than individual terms, right? And the values are there and present, and so they're partisan in that sense. So, okay. We also have this idea of the Soviet socialist novel, right? Katerina Clark, just amazing work struggling through all of those production novels. They're most of them dreadfully boring. Like, oh no, will the steel mill get up and running in time, right? Or you get absurd things like, well, gotta defeat Hitler today. Right? Oh, okay, yeah, for the motherland. Although, to be fair, the Red Army saved the world, so I don't want to make too much light of it. In any case, what happens is, I mean, it's like Probe, right? We get this revelation that when you are following the requirements of Soviet socialist realism, you somehow end up producing, unintentionally, this form, this recognizable form, this structure, right? So in that sense, when Probe sits down with a fairy tale and is surprised to discover that all fairy tales are of a single type in terms of their structure, in terms of, their actual form, Katerina Clark kind of makes the same discovery, right? We sit down with them and we are sort of shocked to discover that all of these things follow this form. So, in The Flower of Seven Colors, we have a hero who is a naturally good person, but not necessarily a conscious person, right? Not a good communist yet. Here's our hero. She has a mentor in the old woman, who tries to make her conscious, who tries to teach her those expressly partisan, but hey, Harry. Hey, buddy. I also have Tuffy in my lap. Tries to teach her those expressly partisan values, and she has a task. And the task in this case, of course, is to learn to make the right wishes, right? To use this flower wisely and as a good Soviet would do. And she has trials, all the toys come to life. She ends up at the North Pole, trow. And at the end, it looks like she is going to fail, right? There's no more wishes left, and she hasn't understood that she was, hilariously in the cartoon version of this, where she's like, I wasted my wish helping this kid walk. And you're like, oh, Zhenya, right? But she, it looks like it's and the mentor steps back in, right? At, just at the moment when we're at the climax, when it seems like the task will be thwarted. And the mentor sets us on the right path. And all of a sudden she becomes conscious. The task is achieved. She realizes how she should make her wishes. She realizes the kind of values she should be operating from with this flower, right? And we get that, bright teleological future, bright future of socialism, right? Tale of the Military Secret. I noticed a lot of people mentioned that they had a hard time with the idea that it was a happy ending, right? Because Katerina Clark tells us that in general, these novels have happy endings. And so we can see, okay, and this is also, I should point out, that is by far the earliest version of these three stories, right? Like, it's the earliest in terms of when it's written and when it's published. So one thing to think about is that the form is maybe not quite cemented in place yet, right, in terms of the evolution of this style of literature. So, for instance, one thing is sort of like, who's the mentor in The Tale of the Military Secret? Maybe the guy that comes riding up from the Red Army. It's not entirely clear. We have a hero. We, have a task. We have trials. We have a climax. What's difficult to understand is the idea, okay, we don't know the mentor exactly. What's difficult to understand is the idea that we have a happy ending. And I think it's important to orient ourselves to Soviet values. It doesn't have to be an individually happy ending, right? We all know that war oftentimes does not lead to individually happy endings. It's a happy ending in terms of the Soviet Union, in terms of the motherland, right? He has kept the secret, right? He has saved the Red Army. He has defeated the White Army, and now he rests in a place of honor. All the other young pioneers go by, the trains go by, and the ships go by, and the planes pass overhead, and everyone salutes his grave. And it's difficult for us to think of that as a happy ending in terms of, oh, this little boy died. But it's a happy ending for Russia, for the Red Army, for the Soviet motherland. And that counts as a happy ending, right? And so it's just a matter of sort of orienting yourself to that kind of value. And then with the old Genie Khatabich, of course, you only have excerpts, so it's a little harder to discern the form in that story. We don't get to see, it's a whole book, and so we gave you parts of it, and you don't get to see the final ending or anything in your reading. But, one thing to think about that I think is interesting about the old Genie Khatabich is actually who is the hero and who is the mentor. And it turns out that it's actually the little boy who's the mentor, right? The genie is a good guy. He has good impulses, but he's not a good communist yet. He's always trying to grant wishes that, like, specifically, like, they bring individual wealth. And then, kids, they're like, no, we should really give this to the library. And so what's interesting, actually, as a footnote about this, is the fact that it was very common at a certain point in Soviet literature for little kids to, like, be the ideological leaders in the stories, because there was this belief that, okay, we had a revolution, and, let's say we had a revolution in this country tomorrow. I've been alive for 38 years today. Literally, today is my birthday. Happy birthday from quarantine to me. It's all right. So I've been alive for 38 years, and now there's a revolution. And even if I'm ideologically committed to that revolution per se, have I been conditioned by my life under capitalism for the last 38 years? Am I going to be able to assimilate? Am I going to be able to really change, to really be a good comrade? Kind of an open question, right? And this is a real thing that the Bolsheviks have to contend with, this idea that you had many people who lived their entire lives, right, under first the Tsardom and then this kind of increasing capitalism at the beginning of the 20th century, et cetera, et cetera. But then if you had little kids that had been born after the revolution, they had spent their entire lives under Soviet communism, or at least the attempt to build it, right? And this sense that they're going to be better positioned than anybody in terms of values, in terms of being raised up in this society to really be good, conscious Soviet socialists. And so it's actually a really common thing in a lot of Soviet literature, like the little children shall lead us. And so here we see the little kid who has grown up, right, in Soviet socialism is leading this older person who isn't familiar with it. Is a good person, but not yet conscious, right? That whole business from the through the trials of developing, becoming a good communist, right? And of course, one of the things we see in the excerpt is a little climax where he just gets so fed up with the genie that he's not, he's like, I can't even be your friend anymore. I can't do it, right? So in that sense, the climax is a little bit like the mentor is tired of your shit. But I can assure you that everything works out to a happy ending in the end. So yeah, you can see that although there are kind of idiosyncrasies in these stories, because they are children's literature, because they are fairy tales and necessarily mirroring elements of the magic tale tradition, so they're not perfect analogs to these production novels, as they're called, that Clark herself is examining. We can still see that there's many ways in which this structure just comes out, and it seems to just emerge naturally, unintentionally, from having to follow those requirements of socialist realism. And so it's really interesting, again, thinking about formalism, thinking back to Propp and that whole idea of the structuralist formalist project. It's really interesting to think about that, we put these certain requirements on art. We don't necessarily give any kind of guidance about what exactly that art has to look like in process, right? We can say that it has to be realistic, but we don't tell you what it necessarily has to be a story about or something, right? That part is left up to you. And yet what emerges over and over again are these same forms or these same structures. It's interesting to think about, how this applies in other cultures that have other requirements, maybe not enforced by the state, but say enforced by the market, right? In our context, in American context, everybody that writes is trying to write what sells, and what sells is determined by, the publishing industry and demographics and marketing and things like that. And then, what kind of structures and forms are being unintentionally created over and over and over again. When we think back to, Marx Week, if we think back to this idea of culture being conditioned so much by mass production, right? By the market. Cultural forms being hijacked in this way, creativity being molded into hegemony and homogeneity. And I mean, in a way, this is sort of what we see in the Soviet Union. Instead of the market determining the requirements on art, we have the state determining the requirements on art. But in any case, when you place those requirements from any source, these kinds of forms and structures can emerge if we look for them. So I think it's interesting to think about and compare to that idea as well. But anyway, like I said, I really think, looking through everybody's posts, people seem to generally get what we were doing this week. So, all right. So stay safe, stay in your houses, wash your hands, wear your masks, and we will repeat this process this week.